Predictions about how the fight between Russia and Ukraine would play out have proved to be woefully inadequate 12 months after it started. So has Europe's biggest conflict since the Second World War changed thinking about how wars are fought and started? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Philip Hampshire. Russia thought it could take Kyiv in a matter of days. Some Western analysts thought the same, but Ukraine is still standing. This has been a conflict that has one foot in the past and one foot firmly in the future, defying many theories. There has been First World War-style massed artillery and infantry storming of trenches on the one hand, but unmanned drones and ultra-modern missiles on the other. There's even been debate about whether tanks are still relevant, even as Kyiv begs the West to provide more of them. Not to mention confusion over how significant a role cyber warfare has played. So, what have the analysts learned from the conflict in Ukraine? So let's meet our guests. From London, we have Roderic Lyne, who's a former British ambassador to Russia. From Stockholm, we have Iuliia Osmolovska, who's director of the Kyiv office at GLOBSEC. And from Washington, D.C., David DesRoches, who is a former official at the U.S. Department of Defense. Thank you, everyone, for joining me. Roderic, if I could start off with you. Do you think this war in Ukraine is different from previous wars? And if so, in what ways?
It's different because we never expected to see a major war like this being fought on European soil in the 21st century. Elements of it similar even to the First World War. In the last few months, you've seen hundreds, indeed thousands of casualties being taken in order just to gain a few hundred meters of territory. In some ways, it's similar to the wars that were fought in Iraq in 1991 and 2003, where there was use of combined arms, tanks, aircraft, infantry working together. The Russians are using tactics of total war, which they applied in Chechnya and Syria, where they slaughtered civilian population in a very indiscriminate way, and that's what they've been doing in Ukraine. But the critical difference from all of these previous wars, obviously now, is that a lot of very high-tech equipment is coming into play. Incredibly precise guided weapons, a lot of sophisticated electronics governing the communications, the drones and so on. So there are some very new elements here.
Iuliia, this war seems to have somewhat of a split personality. On the one hand, we have this World War I element of trenches and people dug in and very small teams of people going room to room within buildings, within towns in a sort of Stalingrad-style fashion. And at the other end, we have swarms of drones and we have cyber warfare. What is going on here to cause this bifurcation?
Well, I would definitely refer you to look into our recent report being done by the international team of experts with Nicola Langer with regard to lessons learned from the war in Ukraine for NATO countries and recommendations what to learn from Ukraine. And precisely, I could agree so that one of the most outstanding thing is about the heavy use of drones. That every small campaign of infantry has its own drone and its own tablet application specially designed for Ukrainian armed forces by the volunteers from the private sector called Kropiva that provides them with the good situational awareness on the ground. And on this, we much supersede the Russian old-fashioned First World War, Second World War style, as you just mentioned.
David, this sort of use of trenches in combat, that's something we've not seen in maybe 20 or 30 years. What is going on here? Is this down to the fact that nobody's maintained air superiority over Ukraine?
You've nailed it. I mean, what you have is the United States and its allies are used to operating a position of air superiority going back really to World War II. There have been flashes in Korea and Vietnam, but normally if you are a Western pattern army, air superiority is a given. And the Russians, by the same time, they are used to operating under positions of air superiority. Neither side has been able to establish it here, primarily because of the proliferation of anti-aircraft weapons down to the squad level with shoulder-fired weapons and more sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons at the national level. And then, as Iuliia said, we have a proliferation of drones down to the squad level. So any troop in the open can be targeted with overhead fire, not just at the Army or Corps level, but as low as the infantry squad level.
Can we expect to see this as an ongoing trend then in wars from here on out? If we were to look at the Russian situation before the war began, at least on paper, Russia had the second largest air force in the world. If it's unable to maintain air superiority, is that because of cheap technologies like man-pads and other forms of portable weaponry, or is it because the Russians haven't been using their planes effectively in a similar fashion as we saw with their tanks?
It's the latter. What we're seeing with modern warfare will be an increased emphasis on electronic warfare and suppression of anti-aircraft defenses, primarily radar, in the opening days of the war. Russia had the ability to do that, but they were poorly led and poorly organized. They developed their electronic warfare in isolation from their communication systems. So when they tried to jam all the Ukrainian anti-aircraft systems, they also wound up jamming all the Russian communication systems. So they stopped, and that allowed the Ukrainians to survive and then eventually establish a deterrent effect over their own land. So what we're seeing now with air attacks is there are things like one-way drones that don't require air superiority, and the majority of them are shot down. I think that coordination of activity across the electromagnetic spectrum is going to be one of the key lessons learned coming out of this war.
Iuliia, when people are looking at drones and looking at the expensive equipment that's been deployed in Ukraine, how do you marry up the difficulties between even a man-pad, even a man-portable aerial defense weapon might cost $200,000 for a single shot, while a drone only costs $20,000, while a plane might cost $100 million? There is a very odd split here in the kinds of weaponry that's being deployed to take down extremely expensive pieces of kit.
Yes, definitely. But what distincts this war from all the previous ones, that we have the most comprehensive combination of all the means available for this war to conduct it in very smart way. Take, for instance, artillery. The Ukrainians are operating the wide range of different artillery systems available in NATO partner countries, and they already started to actually improvise by using at the same time different type of artilleries, which has the trajectory of missiles, which would be very difficult for Russian forces to detect and to destroy. Therefore, and one of the I mentioned already this effect of data-based fight, or data fusion, how Nico Lange in our GLOBSEC report calls it, where the whole system provides with artificial intelligence analysis and recommends the Ukrainian side the priority of the targets, not to the least extent measured by the costs of the equipment that could be destroyed in the first line. And actually, it's always comes up with recommending to destroy the most expensive, the most modern equipment which are in possession of Russian troops. So this is one of the advantages that we have with this artificial intelligence now on the battlefield.
David, you worked at NATO, you worked in the Department of Defense in the United States. How do you handle this asymmetric element to the war, whereby you've got $20,000 drones at one end, and then to take out that relatively cheap drone, you've got to spend $200,000 on a rocket? What do you do in these situations?
That's a good point. So what I've been arguing, and I've been lecturing not just at NATO and military institutions, but places in the Middle East, is that we've neglected passive defense. We've neglected the importance of sandbagging, of hardening even civil facilities. If you look at the photographs of say London in 1939, where you see, you know, entire buildings covered in sandbags. That's something that we've gotten out of the habit of doing. We no longer obscure significant targets from the air, and it's harder to do now because there's thermal sights. But really, we've neglected passive defenses, and we've always assumed that there's an active defense. But as you noted, that costs millions of dollars to defeat a tens of thousands of dollar threat. There's also a lot of research looking at things like pulse lasers, which could be effective, but there'll never be enough of them to defeat the targets. If we defend every military target, you know, if the Ukrainians defend every anti-aircraft battery, as we've seen, the Russians will target electrical substations, and there's never enough weapons to defend all that. So I think we need to take a hard look at cheap, old, passive defenses, and our best defense in many instances is just a lot of sand.
Roderic, as a former ambassador to Russia, in what ways is this war different diplomatically? It seems to have gone from a relatively small-scale regional war to become almost a global proxy conflict, though a lot of people get very, very antsy about that comparison.
No, it's not a global conflict. That's the picture that Putin was trying to put across in his speech today. It's part of the Russian propaganda line that Russia is fighting for its own, to defend itself against a NATO attack as part of a global confrontation. And that's completely untrue. This is a border war. It is a regional conflict. I mean, it's a war being fought on the borders of Ukraine that has been going on now for 9 years, which Russia then stepped up last year into an attempted full-scale invasion, the objective of which was to install a puppet government and gain control of Ukraine. But essentially, it is limited. It is limited to Ukraine, though if Russia succeeded there, there is reasonable speculation that Russia might try this on in other former Soviet states such as Moldova. I think if Belarus ever tried to break out of the Russian grasp, which I think at some point in the future it will, there would be a severe risk that Moscow would use military force again to do that. But that is the context within which this is happening. And it is critically important that we understand, and the world understands, that this is not NATO attacking Russia, as Mr. Putin said. It is Mr. Putin trying to seize control of a sovereign independent state recognized by Russia, borders recognized by Russia since 1991. And that's what this is about. And we are fighting simply to defend the freedom and sovereignty and independence of a UN member state.
David, I saw you nodding there. You are in complete agreement with that.
I could not agree more.
Nonetheless,
yeah, I mean,
nonetheless, NATO...
The messaging of the Russians is that this is a proxy conflict that the West is keeping alive, and if only the West would stop supporting the Ukrainians, peace would break out. And the answer is yes. If you have a side surrendering, there is a kind of peace. You know, France was at peace with Germany in 1941, but the bottom line here is that this is a colonial. I'd go a little bit further than Ambassador Lyne. This is a colonial war of aggression, and the logic that Putin applies to Ukraine applies equally well to the NATO members of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, as well as Moldova, as Ambassador Lyne has noted. And what the West is doing is allowing a sovereign state, which has displayed an unexpected level of stamina and morale, to fight for its existence. It will either exist as a sovereign state or it will exist as a colony. And, you know, that's kind of the obligation that the West has here.
And Georgia with Abkhazia as well, of course. I'll come back and touch on that a little bit more, but I want to bring Iuliia in at this point. Iuliia, are you in agreement with both the other guests?
Well, in respect to the wishes of our Western partners, Ukraine have taken this frame and never asked actually for NATO forces come and fight on the side of Ukraine. What we ask our partners is just to provide with military equipment. But you should still keep in mind that the recent Rammstein meeting brought together 54 countries, which actually considering military equipment supplied to Ukraine and participating each according to their capacities and possibilities. So in any case, this anti-Putin coalition, international coalition, is striking. And Ukraine, as I said at the beginning, with respect to the political sentiments of our partners in the West, never actually asked and was every time very explicit that we are not begging your troops fighting on our side. All we ask you is just to provide us with means to do it by our own hands.
Right, I'm going to bring up a British Ministry of Defence report, which was out within the last 2 weeks. In that, the British Ministry of Defence said that Russia had already got 97% of its army committed in Ukraine. I have a quote here from Ben Wallace, who is the British Secretary of State for Defence, in which he says, and I quote, "If 97% of the Russian army is now committed to Ukraine with an attrition rate very, very high and potentially their combat effectiveness depleted by 40% and nearly 2/3 of their tanks destroyed or broken, that has a direct impact on the security of Europe." Putting that to you, David, if I were an analyst sitting in an office in Langley, Virginia somewhere, I might hear 97% of the Russian forces committed in Ukraine and think, is there a way that I can stress Russia? Maybe open up a second front, perhaps get the Georgians to look at Abkhazia and taking back some of the land that they've lost, or get the Moldovans to look at Transnistria and taking back some of the land that they've lost, or get some of the Syrian rebels to go after Tartus, the Russian port in Syria. Find a second front somewhere just to stress the Russians more.
Well, first off, I don't think we're that smart. And I don't think we're that coordinated. I mean, the American and thus the Western reaction to the Ukrainian invasion has been entirely reactive. I haven't seen the emergence or even discussion of the emergence of anything like a comprehensive strategy to roll back Russia. So I don't think we have the organization. I don't think we have the political will, because something like that actually plays into Putin's line that this is a Western war of aggression waged against Russia. And then finally, I think it's important to note that Russia is running out of materiel, but so is the West. A lot of the initial support that came to the Ukrainian forces was former members of the Warsaw Pact clearing out their old Warsaw Pact equipment. I think some of them were glad to get rid of it. We've seen that the European defense industries are extremely small scale, and you noted in your opening comments that the reintroduction of large artillery barrages where countries are firing tens of thousands of rounds per day, it's not something that we expected, and it's not something that we were set up for. We're struggling to sustain the provision of key supplies, most notably artillery ammunition, to the Ukrainians. So the idea of a second front, I think, is first off just not being talked about, but secondly would be extremely difficult to support and probably would be unwise. I think that we need to focus on the main prize. And I think that Russia is big enough that it could handle a diversion. It would probably divert more of our precious resources than it would of Russia's.
Iuliia, do you agree with that?
No, I actually wanted
That's always interesting. Go
to
on.
say that I wanted to say that you've picked up a completely smart strategic approach that we actually even tried to recommend to our Western partners in our different GLOBSEC paper, security scenarios and implications for Western partners, where we actually saw that the possibility of having these new zones of conflict around Russia would distract Russian sources actually to them, making them even more weaker. But in reality, what we see right now, our anticipations or hopes that Georgians or Moldovans would stand against Russia and try to revoke this conflict to settle their issues, long-lasting issues, in reality turned out to be completely the opposite. it. So Georgians explicitly said to us, and I just mentioned the Prime Minister mentioned to me at the Munich conference recently that they are completely into peaceful settlement of the conflict. So there is no sign of Georgia playing this smart game, especially given the more wider political context of Georgia. For Moldovan as well, initially they were completely against it, but right now, when security risks for Moldova is rising from Russia, I think that they're reconsidering a bit their position. But look what Russia is doing now. Because they're having this defeat in Ukraine, a severe defeat in Ukraine, they're considering of having some small blitzkrieg wars in the countries they consider to be quite vulnerable and easy to get to the targets. Georgia, Moldova, Western Balkans. So I can see here that, as the colleague mentioned, if there is no political and strategic approach and very difficult to handle this big game on the side of Western partners, so that this game will be played by Russia. So there is security risks arising in this case.
Roderic, another element to this that we haven't mentioned yet, which makes it different from some of the previous conflicts, the world is a much more globalized place than it has been, say, 20 or 30 years ago. So the difficulties diplomatically between the West and Russia are having spillover effects elsewhere. In particular, of course, China leaps to mind. How different do you think that makes this war to previous conflicts?
I think the role of China is extremely important because the Chinese are, to a degree, sitting on the fence, offering some verbal support to Russia, but not actually supporting their attempts to swallow up Ukraine and not providing them with direct military assistance. But in any conflict, you have got countries that are directly involved. You have other countries that may be suppliers, that may be potentially involved, but aren't actually involved in the fighting. I don't think this is hugely different from that. I think if you look at the Second World War, you had a completely global conflict. But a better example is what happened in Iraq in 1991, because Saddam Hussein had taken over the territory of a neighboring state and he had to be driven out of it. Now, it took a coalition of 33 countries backed by pretty well the entire United Nations, including Russia, to achieve that. And I think we're in a generally similar situation now. You had 100 members of the United Nations voted against Russia's attempts to invade Ukraine. You only had a very small handful of countries that actually supported Russia. And one is trying to marshal, as the Russians are trying to oppose, international forces in support of the principle of restoring international law and order and the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, as we did in Kuwait in 1991.
Iuliia, obviously, Roderic there, completely correct on the diplomatic front. However, there is the question of technology and supply chains. We've already seen reports coming out of Russians having to steal washing machines in order to get hold of chips because they've been somewhat isolated from globalized supply chains. Does this not make it a little bit different from previous wars where, for instance, in the war in Yugoslavia, the Croatians just started up an entire armaments industry, more or less, not quite from scratch, but more or less from scratch?
Yeah, but do count on size of the needs because Russians are currently extremely experiencing huge shortages of the necessary assembly parts for production of missiles. This is something which was observed and proved by our military intelligence and openly declared that right now the capacity of them to reproduce missiles in 1 month has been significantly reduced. But I want to get back to the point of the allies, the minor allies or a small group of countries who sided up with Russia. Please pay attention that even Belarus, who are in a state union with Russia, didn't join officially Russia as an ally in this war. So officially Russia is all alone. And this isolation is getting more and more visible for the whole world.
David, I'm going to put the same question to you if I can. Do you think that the supply chains make this war different from previous ones?
Yeah, one of the real shocking revelations is a number of think tanks, such as Iuliia's, have been taking apart missile detritus on the battlefield. And what we're seeing is that almost all Russian precision and high-tech weaponry, from their latest model tanks to their missiles, is reliant on some level of Western technology. So there is chips, components. The latest Russian tank has French thermal sights in it. So there is potential points there to starve it. And what we're seeing is that Russia is under stress. So they're at the point now where they're firing surface-to-air missiles in a surface-to-surface mode. That's extremely expensive. A surface-to-air missile has to be incredibly accurate to hit a moving target. To fire it at a target on the ground is kind of like having a Rolls-Royce pull a plow. It can be done. It is effective, but at a time when Russia is under some degree of fiscal stress, although not as much due to the high price of oil, Russia is having to, they're running into trouble with their production. We've seen Medvedev visit a tank factory in Siberia and making this point that, industry is a key performance of this. And I think the British estimates, which are at the high end of the anti-Russia scale, show that Russia is going to have to start rationing its artillery ammunition. And I think that Russia will be running out of missiles for large level strikes fairly soon.
Roderic, Iuliia, David, thank you very much, all three of you, for joining me today. It's been a fascinating conversation. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just head over to YouTube and search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me here and all of the team, thank you for watching and goodbye.